מים רבים לא יכלו לכבות.
Anti-Semitism is not just a normal bigotry.
Anti-Semitism is known as a shape-shifting virus. I fear that this hatred, which has been endemic, which has been insidious, which has been as old as man itself, is now being supercharged by social media.
Think about it like an intellectual disease that's built into the foundations of the civilization that we live in.
You might think that this is rather arrogant of me, but I do believe it is a special form of racism. It's different to other forms of racism.
This is the traditional idea of anti-Semitism that anyone who grew up in the West will find familiar. An ancient primordial superstition whose seed survives in the soul of each of us and reappears regularly through history, each time in different form. For that reason, we'll call it the dormant disease model. The biggest problem with the model is that it's so general that it could be anything.
Socrates would ask questions.
The theory is unfalsifiable, and worse, not very actionable. How do we recognize it, predict it? More importantly, how do we cure it? These issues have made space for a new theory of anti-Semitism. Let's call it the re-imported virus model of anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism may be ingrained in the cultural fabric of certain segments of our society.
We've got people in our country who are calling Australia home when they don't have Australia in their heart.
And the theory goes something like this. We Europeans used to be infected with a virus of anti-Semitism.
It's an ancient hatred, perhaps the most ancient among the monotheisms.
But we've faced our demons and inoculated ourselves. However, migrants from less advanced societies are re-importing that virus back into ours.
And we've imported it.
In the same way that they might be re-importing tuberculosis or smallpox. Given the demographics of the protests we see on our streets today, you can understand how this theory has intuitive appeal.
However, there's a third model which also merits attention.
Let's call it the unhealthy organism model, in which anti-Semitism is just one of many potential viruses or diseases lurking in the bowels of society, and when the system is weak enough, one of them erupts, just like HIV, by hijacking the sociological equivalent of CD4 positive T cells, which is our tribal instinct. The thing that we evolved to protect us from societal threats. It hijacks that instinct and directs it into hatred for specific groups. Each instance may be different, so one could call it shape-shifting, but only in the sense that its specific targets, mechanisms, and manifestations are context-dependent. It is not shape-shifting in its essence, which is that it takes advantage of the tendency of tribal apes to be suspicious, sometimes fearful, and even sometimes hateful of apes from other tribes. It's in our nature, as demonstrated by people who study racism and discrimination as a general human phenomenon, as Isabel Wilkins did in her highly readable book about caste. She makes the case that all forms of racism or discrimination are manifestations of behaviors which have a common set of core characteristics, the most important being this: the actual divisions themselves are totally arbitrary. Religion, ethnicity, occupational category, language, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's why they seem shape-shifting to us. That's also why recognizing that fact is a fantastic way to build solidarity around the challenge of fighting it, because it really is a shared objective.
The treatment of anti-Semitism as distinct from all other forms of racism really undermines the important work that is already being done across racial lines to address all forms of racism.
Our monkey brains are hardwired to recognize tribe, but tribe could be anything. If you've ever participated in one of those exercises in experimental psychology, where a class or group is divided arbitrarily, and after a few hours of carefully structured games, are replicating minor versions of all the superstitions and animosities that can actually divide society, if you've ever done that for half a day, you know how easy it can be, and how eerie it is to realize that.
It can even be on something as simple as eye color, as Jane Elliott famously and controversially demonstrated using her own class of third graders as guinea pigs. But just because it can be anything doesn't mean it shall be anything. certain things are more attractive as targets for our tribal instinct. Low status and power is probably number one, which is why institutionalized racism and discrimination against slaves, or former slaves, or conquered people, or simply people who live in less developed societies. Those are obvious candidates. That's why, if you're watching this in Australia, unless you're Greek, my ancestors probably referred to yours as Varavati, the origin of the English word barbarian. Behavioral and personality differences, like homosexuality, gender dysmorphia, autism, or other traits that might make someone seem different or eccentric, are likewise easy to understand targets of this tribal instinct, and no doubt explains the fate of many people condemned as witches and heretics over the ages. And if one is part of a community that is inherited by sheer accident of history and the intellectual laziness of our forefathers, an asterisk next to their identity, that too is something which will amplify the odds that, at any given moment of societal breakdown, it will be that community, rather than some other, who is chosen as the victim. That might explain why Ashkenazi Jews in Europe experienced antisemitism as
not just a normal bigotry.
Because to them it was different. They weren't impoverished Roma moving from town to town. They weren't sharecroppers or naked indigenous people.
Think about it like an intellectual disease that's built into the foundations of the civilization that we live in.
They weren't the wretched of the earth. They were like anybody, from peasants in the shtetl to physicians and bankers to kings. And yet the focus of this tribal instinct and all the cruelty it renders seems so reliably to land on them.
This hatred, which has been endemic, which has been insidious, which has been as old as man itself.
It's no wonder that they came to believe there must be something unique about it.
I do believe it is a special form of racism. It's different to other forms of racism.
This isn't to minimize anyone's trauma.
It's this irrational hatred.
It's not about comparative victimization. It's about diagnosis, making sure we are actually diagnosing the problem. Consider the example of AIDS. HIV hit different in different communities. In Africa, AIDS was a disease of heterosexual men and made them victims to well-known maladies: tuberculosis, meningitis, and gastrointestinal bacteria that did not threaten gay men in San Francisco. Their maladies were entirely different. One could imagine, therefore, that from the perspective of an ACT UP activist in the 80s, AIDS for gay American men
is different.
That would have been totally understandable. We would not judge someone for thinking that, but it would still be wrong.
Socrates would ask questions.
What's worse, if we simply accepted that argument because it was their lived experience, if you like, we might still be on a wild goose chase trying to figure HIV out. The point is simply this: all of us, regardless of our background, are born with the innate tendency to continue a struggle that started a long time ago and looks something like this. Turns out, we have a gun analyst on the team who wrote a large language model to translate the barks and vocalizations of the lead ape in the top tribe into English. And here's what he's saying.
Our country is the best place on earth to live, and we want to keep it that way.
2 million years of evolution, ladies and gentlemen. From rainforest to Rhodes Scholarship.
Israel is the most wonderful country in the world, the most remarkable. I can prove it on every level.
And all the way to Harvard University. Now, before you get too depressed about human nature, remember that drive isn't destiny. We may have an innate drive to tribal conflict, just as we have an innate drive to consume sugar, and both for the same reasons. Once upon a time, it was adaptive. It's no longer adaptive, and that doesn't mean we're destined to type 2 diabetes. We can master our tendencies, including tendencies towards conflict and division, but only by recognizing their drivers and addressing them proactively. In other words, by building healthy societies, or healthy bodies, healthy organisms, to return to our medical analogy. What does that mean? Rather than only talking about rules and restrictions on speech in the hope that perhaps that might have an effect on thought.
The cities should not be utilised for that. There should be places designated away from where the Jewish community might venture, where people can demonstrate.
Let's build channels of communication to make racist ideas less compelling.
Which side are you on, boys? Which
rather than only talking about safety and security.
And that is not to in any way attack the right of people to express their views. But at some point, every single week becomes intimidatory.
Maybe building mechanisms to ensure people's capacity to express grievances and be heard.
If we have influence in certain segments of society, whether it be business, the arts, the legal community, academia, it is because that influence has been earned through our blood and through our toil. And it is time, I believe, to exert that influence.
Which makes political violence much less likely.
Across all sectors where Jews have influence, we need to bring that influence to bear.
As we said in our last video, that's fair enough. But any solution to social cohesion must also explicitly account for the fact that every Australian wants to have their voice be heard and their influence brought to bear. There is no such thing as social cohesion otherwise. There is only, at best, peace and tranquility, which is nice if that's all one is after, but it's the tranquility of the narcotic, the opiate of the powerful. The simple fact is that not every Australian can pick up the phone and call the Premier, or text the chair of the ABC, or broadcast an email to its board and its exco. We'll stipulate that if Mr. Mashney could do all those things, he too, along with every other protester on a college campus and in the streets, would find better ways to spend their weekends. But every Australian can say,
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
if the anger and the frustration is great enough, and take action accordingly. There's a reason the movie that made that line famous came out in 1976, along with the violence associated with that time period, even in the richest countries in the world. Because that period was not the harmonious, culturally homogeneous paradise that young right-wingers fantasize about today. We really don't want to go back to those days, nor should we just presume that that was as bad as things could ever get. Social cohesion is an incredibly valuable public good. It's not a gift from God. Prior generations worked hard to create it, and we have to do the same to preserve it. Which brings us to the most important implication. Rather than listening only to holy men who believe themselves to represent a diverse range of voices in Australia,
we've got people in our country who hate our country.
But as we shall see in the next two videos,
anti-Israel is really anti-Jewish because they want Israel to disappear.
They know that they cannot say Jew, so they say Zionist.
Are dangerously out of touch with the reality for large and growing segments of Australian society.
Real Islamophobia would be a terrible and unwarranted thing.
If and when evidence of Islamophobia presents itself, yes, we should condemn it.
Demand better standards of rigor, empathy, and evidence from people who have not demonstrated a handle on the underlying divisions in our society.
These are politically determined. They're not simply because that's the way Arabs are. Right. That's the way Muslims are. And it's that racist discourse that I think is part of what makes it so hard for us to imagine that equality actually could make us safe.
So, why might we be losing the war against anti-Semitism given the three models we've described? It might be nothing more remarkable than having the wrong mental model of anti-Semitism. The wrong mental model of the disease.
شعب الأحرار صاحب القرار صفقة شاو صفقة شاو صفقة شاو 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 لا صفقة ظل ولا صفقة عار فلسطين عربية